So we're very pleased to have Professor Tzvi Ganel with us today. Tzvi did his BSc at Tel Aviv University in psychology, sociology, and anthropology. He then continued to do his PhD in cognitive psychology under the supervision of Professor Jonathan Goshen-Gottstein and Professor Robert Lubo. He then did his postdoc in Mel Goodale's lab at the University of Western Ontario in the Department of Psychology. Since then, he has been in Ben Gurion University of the Negev, where he is now faculty and leads the laboratory for visual perception and action. His lab investigates visual perception and control of action using diverse methods, including online movement tracking, very precise ones, fMRI and behavior. And we're very pleased to have you today in our seminar, Tzvi, to hear about your research. So welcome.
Thank you, Sharon, for inviting me. I hope you hear me well.
Yes.
Actually, it was a challenge to prepare a talk for this seminar, but I think it has been worthwhile because, like, in the last year, through the COVID crisis, research has been interrupted heavily. In my lab, in which I deal with movement control and tracking, and I need to see the real subject inside the lab. So the flow of events was interrupted, and it helped me now get a better view of what I did before and what I want to do next, hopefully soon. So I hope to give you a perspective of my research in the last few years on perceptual interaction in grasping. And of course, if you have any question, you can interrupt me. Maybe I'll talk too fast. I try to wrap it as best as I could have. And the main framework here is the idea that vision for action and vision for perception are mediated by distinct, although interacting, visual pathways in the brain. So, for example, when we want to identify an object versus when we want to interact to have a motor interaction with this object to grasp the cup, for example, the idea that we use different types of computations that are mediated by different projections in the cortex. So one of the people behind this model, Mel Goodale, is also a great collaborator and friend, and you'll see a lot of his name later because we work together on some of these projects. So the idea is that the dorsal stream mediates vision for action, projected from early visual corticals to the dorsal stream, versus the ventral stream that mediates vision for perception, conscious recognition of shape, objects, faces. There is lots of research on the ventral stream. What I'll try to do is focus on the differences when it comes to behavior between the two streams. But first, I have to talk about the famous patient DF. I think one of the well-known patients in neuroscience, partly due to her willingness to participate in so many experiments until these days. So DF, when she was a young woman, she was poisoned by carbon monoxide, which affected her visual recognition. She's suffering from visual form agnosia, a severe case of visual form agnosia. Although in other modalities, she's doing fine. But what's interesting in this patient is despite her inability to recognize objects, faces, letters, etc., she's very good, almost normal in many aspects when she interacts visual-motor interactions with objects in her environment are performed in a natural manner. So when we talk about our brain, peculiarly, our lesion was very focused on ventral regions that mediate form perception, hello, and other regions, but mainly here. I'm not going to talk much about DF and other tasks, motor tasks, in which she showed this dissociation between what she can do motorly and what she cannot do in terms of perception. If you want me, I can go back to it later. I want to focus on grasping. So grasping will be a model motor task throughout this talk. It's an automatic, well-practiced task humans engage, and it's quite complex, although it seems very simple. When we grasp an object, we need to open our fingers, tuned to the size and other properties, maybe shape, etc., of the target object. For example, we don't want to open our fingers too much or too little in order to successfully grasp an object. For example, here what you see is that the trajectory of the apertures between the fingers during flight, during grasping. And you see that the fingers open with time to a maximum amount and then close on the object. Now, this maximum opening is very important here because it's a signature of the computation of size for the purpose of grasping. And there is a very, very high correlation between the maximum grip aperture and the size of the target object. And we are very accurate at distinguishing between sizes of objects based on only the maximum grip aperture here. At least if you have a good tracking device or very accurate tracking device, you can see how accurate grasping can be. So I use the trajectory of the fingers of the aperture and focus on this aspect in time, as well as on other aspects related to the aperture between the fingers. There are other aspects of action that I won't describe or look at today, like force, grip force, etc. So let's focus on this one. And if you have any other question, maybe I'll be able to answer it as well. Okay, so this is the main framework. Let's go back to DF for a second. DF, as I said, she has severe difficulties in recognizing objects, in perceiving shape, size, etc. If you ask her to tell the difference between objects of two different sizes, and these are very different objects, and she has to reproduce the size by opening her fingers only to show how big it is, you can see that her manual estimation ability is poor. However, when she grasps the object and you look at the maximum grip aperture of her fingers during grasping, you can see that things are very different. Her fingers are highly tuned to the size of the target object. Okay? And let's forget about patients for a while and go back to people with normal vision. And I'll focus on several domains that I have been looking at in my lab to show you that with the normal participants, we can get the same or similar types of dissociation if we look very carefully between perception and action. I call it the psychophysics of grasping because I take insights from classic psychophysics and look at this aspect during motor control and during grasping. So I'll talk about illusions and our ability or inability to disregard context. I'll also look more closely about the perception of object shape, different dimension of an object, holistic processing of an object, and also on the effect of context on the perception of size. And so we'll be looking at 4 domains in which we can look and observe differences between perception and action, at least something that I did in my lab. We look at the effect of irrelevant context, the effect of holistic processing, which also can cause illusions, and I'll talk about it soon. We'll look at the resolution of size, Weber's law, and the effect of the range of the context in which the object is presented. Okay, so I'll start with illusions, which is a very the most debated field, I would say, in this domain. And it started, I think, with one paper by Agliotti et al., in which they used the Ebbinghaus illusion to try to see what happens when you grasp object in the context of the illusion. So we know that the Ebbinghaus illusion heavily affects our perception due to size contrast between the object and our relative perception of size. What Agliotti and his colleagues showed, they had different conditions, and I want to focus maybe on one of them, which for me is one of the interesting conditions that they use. So first they put circular objects within the illusion and looked at the trajectory between the fingers during grasp, and they compared it to conscious perception. Okay, now when you create a situation, you can create a situation in which the 2 objects in the middle are perceived as equal in size. In order to do that, you have to artificially increase this object physically to make it appear at the same size as this object, okay? But in this situation in which participants report that they see an object with an equal size here and here, we can look at the trajectory of the fingers in flight. And this is what they did. And they show that even in this situation in which you perceive the object as equal, your fingers are tuned to the real properties, the real size of the object, and open larger for the larger object compared to the smaller one. Okay, so this is one aspect of the result. Why am I highlighting this aspect? Because the Ebbinghaus illusion has been highly debated. Dozens of paper debates, arguments, confounds, whatever you want. I think this particular study, result, has not been challenged over the years. So, but nevertheless, I want to take you to a different illusion, which has been less debated in this context of differences between perception and action. The Ponzo illusion, which we used in a lab as one of the illusions to dissociate the 2 systems in terms of behavior. So here, the version of the Ponzo illusion that we use, and the optotrack system that we use to track the finger position. And what we presented is I think is a more unique case. We took the last example to an extreme. You see 2 objects here, and due to the illusion, I think most of you would perceive this one as longer. But actually, physically, we created a situation in which the one that you perceive longer is actually the shorter one. But due to the illusion, which has a tremendous effect, the illusion is larger than the difference between the objects. So why is it important to have this condition? Because here we ask participants to grasp the object that they feel is big or small. Now, we look only at the trials in which they are wrong, in which they are deceived by the illusion, and then look at the trajectory of the fingers, at the aperture between the fingers. So we can identify these trials here. You can see the various conditions. We can identify the trials in which they were wrong and look at the aperture between the fingers. In these trials, participants felt that this object is smaller than this one, but the fingers' apertures were larger for the physically larger object, compared to the physically smaller object. And you can see what happens when participants do not grasp, but make estimation of size. You can see that the estimation are in accord with what they perceive consciously as the effect of the illusion. Okay? If you have any questions, please stop me.
Yes, I have a question. Do they show this difference right from the beginning or only as they get closer to the target?
A good one. We have, yes, I mean, it's not, even if you look at the trajectories for this control background without any illusion, so it's not that the fingers immediately open to the sizes. It depends on the differences between the sizes. So yes, the fingers open to the differences, not immediately, but we didn't see in any stage of the movement, as far as I recall, that the fingers opened wrongly during the initial stages of the movement to reflect the effect of the illusion. But yes, we also had some studies in which we follow the trajectory during time, and maybe I'll show you other results later. Yeah, but you are right. Our main focus is on the later stages of the movement in which the fingers are more tightly tuned to the side. Did I answer your question, or?
Well, I could argue then that what they do is that they compare the position, they see their fingers, so they could compare the position of the fingers with the object and maybe correct this way. That's why I was asking about the dynamics.
Yeah, I know this argument. It's very reasonable to make this argument. Yeah, I agree. But I think I have data to show you that it's not the case. I mean, this does not the only explanation, or not the main explanation for this type of dissociation. Okay, but you're right. I mean, when we interact with objects, we have feedback during flight, and when we approach the object, the correspondence between our fingers and the object becomes tighter. I agree. Okay. Any other questions? Recently, we extended these findings to other illusions and to a different type of task in which we asked participants to grasp object with two hands, with both their hands, bigger objects. And here we use the Ponzo illusion, slightly a different design, but again, the same logic, like the size differences between the objects are overshadowed by the strength of the illusion. So you see here, basically you perceive this object as larger than this one, but it's the other way around. And we used another illusion in which just for illusion, the railroad illusion, in which this object is perceived as smaller than this one, although it's larger, and vice versa. We had two configurations of the design. I won't go into the entire detail, but the logic is the same. And when we looked at the trajectories of the two hands now during flight, what we saw, this is for the Ponzo illusion, that so for manual estimations, of course, your perception is affected by the illusion, although you are wrong. So, but when we look at the trajectories between the hands, so you open your hands wider to the objects that are really bigger, physically bigger, not illusory bigger. And this is for the Ponzo illusion. It is also true for the Jasper illusion. So it also extends to bimanual grasping, which is benefits. You know, one important aspect of bimanual grasping, besides the fact that it's with the two hands, is that you have lots of your degree of freedom when grasping is much larger. You are not blocked by the biomechanical constraint of your hand. So it's a good answer to various confounds that could be introduced to the design of unimanual grasping. Okay. So this was for illusions. I'll skip to the next stage, to a different arena in which we looked at differences between perception and action. And in this case, we looked at the holistic processing of shape. Now, if we look at this very simple shape of a rectangle, so we see two dimensions, the width and the height. And when I talk about holistic processing, what I mean is that you cannot process one aspect of an object without being affected by other aspects of the same object. So it's shape, it's not a dimension that you process when it comes to perception. And it has many consequences, this holistic processing, including illusions. This is, I think, one of the most common illusions that we encounter every day. I mean, when we talk about illusions, usually we talk about like rare situations in which our perceptual system is wrong, but really it's a normal processing in other situations. The illusion of shape, in this case, the height width illusion, we encounter it every day, many times a day. We cannot ignore the height of for example, this rectangle, and we perceive this one as wider than this one just because this one is shorter, and it's true for people, it's true for buildings, it's true for everything. So this illusion taps holistic processing of shape. One example of holistic processing of shape, and we used it later. But also, if we don't only look at illusions, we can also look at how well people can process one dimension of a shape, of a rectangle in this case, while ignoring irrelevant dimension of the same object. And for that purpose, I'll introduce the Garner speed classification test, which is a tool that I use in my lab to look at the perception of shape. So here, if we present these four rectangles based on two different widths and two different heights, we can create a situation in which participants judge width, but the irrelevant dimension of height is kept constant. So throughout the entire block, they are presented only with these two examples, and have to classify with which object is, whether the object is wide or narrow, for example. In another block, they are presented only with the taller object. So we call this type of block the baseline block, because in baseline, you don't have to worry about the irrelevant dimension. It's always kept in a constant value. So the only decision is made based on the relevant dimension, which is width in this case. But in the filtering blocks, you have to filter out the irrelevant dimension in this case, and you can be presented with either of the rectangles. So not only width changes randomly, but also height changes randomly, which could make this task more difficult than the task in baseline. So worse performance in filtering compared to baseline, which could be expressed as in longer RTs, for example, means that you suffer from Garner interference, which means that you cannot process one dimension and not the other relevant dimension at the same time. And when it comes to rectangles, of course, you cannot process width without being interfered by height, which is a well-known finding. Okay, so we took this inside the grasping arena and asked participants not only to make speed classifications and other tasks that relate to perception, but also to grasp the object. And what we showed, it was a while ago, we showed that when it comes to grasping, you don't suffer from Garner interference when you grasp the shape of an object, which means you can process one aspect of an object without being interfered by other aspects belonging to the same object. And we showed it across various tests and conditions. It was replicated. I'm saying it was fairly replicated there are always arguments in this field, and I won't go into that now, but it's fair. I just want to be fair with everyone and to say, if almost everything I will say is controversial to some extent, but I truly believe in it. Okay, so now I won't go back. And again, we also showed that the illusion that I showed you, the height-width illusion, affects your perceptual judgments, estimates, but does not affect your grasping trajectory. Again, by looking at the aperture in flight. Any questions before I continue? Okay. So we also ourselves replicated this finding in a different condition in which we didn't only look at the reaction time, but also an accuracy. So we can measure accuracy for perception in action, and I'll talk about that soon. One aspect of accuracy is the variability of the response. And we use that to show that when it comes to variability of the response, we see Garner interference both in accuracy and speed when it comes to manual estimation, perceptual estimation, but we don't see it for grip apertures. Okay, so it's not only reaction time, it's also other aspects of the kinematic aspects of your movements that are affected by holistic process or not affected by holistic processing.
Sorry, could I just ask a question?
Yes, of course.
In this data, is the grasping done in the course of the perceptual judgment task? That is, they're picking up the rectangles and solving them?
So you're asking if it's within the same trial?
Yeah.
In this particular set of experiments, not. We have separate blocks. In one block, you just make manual estimations of size, and in a different block, you grasp. It's not contingent.
But in the grasping trials, you are sorting the blocks. You're picking them up and putting them into two piles or something.
No, you just simply ask to grasp an object, pick it up, and put it down without any constraints. But also in the perceptual task, you are just asked to show me how wide it is.
Sorry, I thought this was a Garner sorting task, no?
In its classical version, you have to sort it. But in this adjusted version that the perceptual task is not sorting, but just making manual estimations. We wanted it to be as similar as possible to the grasping task. This is why we changed the perceptual task, but it works either way. Okay. Let's talk about the third domain, and this domain is concerned with visual resolution to size. And of course, I expect most of you to be familiar with Weber's law, one of the foundation of perception in any domain, any modality, which states that our J&D, the just noticeable difference to detect change, is a linear function of the magnitude of or the intensity of the stimulus we see or we encounter. And it's been, of course, one of the foundations of perception across different modalities and for centuries. And now, just give you an example, when it comes to size, our ability to tell the difference between these two circles is superior to our ability to tell the difference between these two circles, although the difference in diameter is the same in the two examples. Because our J&D here is much larger than our J&D here, okay, for these two circles, which is in line with Weber's law. Just an example, but let's go to grasping. So we tested whether Weber's law applied not only for perception, but also for grasping movements toward objects And this project was with the collaboration of Daniel Gom, my dear colleague, who helped me a lot to conceptualize how to do this and how to translate this language to classic psychophysics, which was not very easy then. So what we wanted to do is to look if J and Ds during grasping adhere to Weber's law, whether J and Ds increase with object size, just as when it comes to perception. The problem was that we had to find a method to measure J and Ds during grasping. And the method that we used was based on the idea that when you make estimates, perceptual reproduction, your estimates become less accurate or more variable as the size of the object gets higher or larger, which makes the standard deviation, the within subject standard deviation of your responses a good measure of your J and D. And this is something that came from more classic literature on how to measure J and Ds using the method of adjustment. So standard deviation was our measure for J and D, and we can now look at it even in grasping, in which we use the aperture, the grip aperture, the standard deviation of the grip aperture in flight as a measure of visual resolution during grasping. And unlike for perceptual judgments, what we showed that your J and D for grasping different sized objects did not change with size. Therefore, in violation of Weber's law. It was a while ago, but since then, there were at least several dozen papers replicating this effect. Again, with restrictions, maybe not everyone would agree, but I think there's good support from different labs for the idea that Weber's law does not affect your visual motor control when it comes to grasping. Okay, and we also, as before, we extended it to bimanual grasping of bigger objects more recently, and showed, here you can see the apertures. These are the average apertures for different size objects, like a very large set of objects. And this is the J and Ds for the same object set for grasping and for perceptual estimations, in which you have to estimate the size using your hands. And again, you see violation of Weber's law, no increase with size. J and Ds do not increase with size. When it comes to grasping, they do increase with size when it comes to perception. Okay. Any other questions before I continue? Last but not least, because it was the more recent arena that we went to, again with the collaboration of my former student Gal Namdar and Daniel Gom, we showed that the context in which an object is presented affects perceptual resolution. And what do I mean by context? I mean here the temporal context. So if you look at an object, for example, this 40 millimeter object that you see here is equal to the 40 millimeter object that you see here in this other block. The only difference is that the other stimuli within the set have a wider range here compared to the other, to this range. So they are more spaced here in the narrow range context compared to the wide range context. But again, this effect is temporal because in each trial you see only one object and you have to make your decision. So what we looked at is whether the J and D, your resolution, to tell the difference between the size the sizes of an object differs based on the context of the set. And what we showed, not only for size, we showed it also for weighted. This is only for perception. We showed that the wider the range of the set, the poorer your resolution. So your resolution is not only based on the single stimulus you see or you perceive, but also on the resolution of the entire set. The larger or the poorer resolution of the set, the poorer resolution of a single stimulus within the set. So again, it's a demonstration of how relative our perceptual system is, not only for average perceived size, but also for your resolution to tell the difference between sizes. Okay, I'm not saying we are the first to show this, but we are the first to show it with JND, I think. Hopefully, maybe someone will say I'm wrong, but Danny approved it. Any questions on that?
I have a question, but I'll keep it for the discussion. I mean.
Okay. So you won't be surprised if I tell you that we took this arena and tested it with grasping. And again, it was quite simple. We asked participants to either grasp the objects or to make perceptual estimates of their size. And again, we showed that when it comes to grasping, there is no effect of range of the set compared to perceptual estimates that are affected. So what I showed you until now in this first part of the talk was that psychophysical attributes of grasping can be dissociable of those of perception. Apertures are not biased to the same amount by illusions. And unlike perception, which treats objects in a relative term, actions can be directed analytically to a single attribute of an object. And resolution for grasping is independent both of size and of the range of the context, and the range of the context in which it is presented. Okay, so different arenas to argue for the same idea that you can find even in normal participants indications for dissociation between the way you perceive and the way you interact with objects using grasping. Okay, but now I want to go forward and ask what happens when in our present environment, present arena of interactions in which we interact with the two-dimensional objects on a computer screen, or in a virtual environment, interactions which become more frequent in past and future, in present and future settings. So what I want to start with is with one study that I found very interesting, and this study by Holmes and Heath, what they looked is in a trajectory of grasping for 2D line drawings and compared it to trajectory toward real objects of the same size. And what they showed, I won't go into the entire trajectory and kinematic aspect, but the interesting thing here is that they showed that J and Ds do not obey Weber's law when it comes to grasping. We know that. But they do obey Weber's law when it comes to 2D grasping. So the trajectories of the fingers, when you interact with virtual objects, in this case, line drawings, in the J and Ds of these trajectories increase with size, which is very interesting, I think. Okay, so we followed up on this line of studies, and we looked at grasping, compared grasping of 3D objects to grasping of 2D objects, to our approach to grasp objects that were presented on a computer screen.
Can I have a short question of clarification?
Yes.
Sorry, I came in late. When you say grasping, Jenny, grasping is in reporting the size that you grasp or in mimicking it with your fingers?
Oh, yeah. Excellent question. Thank you. I missed this part earlier in the talk. I should have said that.
Not only me.
When you mimic a grasp movement, you're not grasping, you're perceiving. Like we have lots of evidence to show that pantomime grasping is not grasping, is actually a perceptual estimate of size. Okay? And I won't go into it, but it's very similar, the kinematics of pantomime. Like if I want you to show me how big it is or how to grasp it, the kinematics look very similar.
So the kinematics has the JND, the Weber law, if you try to mimic it?
Yes.
But if you report...
They have illusions, they suffer from all perceptual regularities that you can imagine.
So what you talk about is reporting the size that you grasp, right?
Here in this task?
In this work, yeah.
Here I ask them to place their fingers on the edges of the object, not pantomime. I mean, it could be pantomime, but the task is not to pantomime, but to directly approach the object.
But then you correct it by feeling, right? I mean, there's no problem to, if you have the object, then you simply have the feedback of touching, right? So
yeah, which comes back to Rafi's question in the beginning. So this is a good condition in which I can look at the effect of feedback, because here you have perfect visual feedback online. You can, in principle, direct your finger to the exact point of the edge of the object based on visual feedback only, but you don't. Okay?
I'll not stop you. Okay, I didn't understand it, but okay.
What was wrong here?
No, I didn't understand the task. I'm not sure if I'm not holding because I enter late. So the task is you have an object and you ask the person to touch it, right?
Right.
And then how do you judge the JND? What is the JND that you judge?
So I can look at JND, I can look at the aperture between the fingers at the standard deviation and the variability of the aperture.
But when you touch it, you fix it by touching. I mean, you hold it. So
you don't hold it.
What sort of error do you have?
Virtually interact with it because you don't hold it, right? It's on the computer screen.
No, I'm talking about the physical ones. You're talking about the 3D.
No. The physical, of course, you touch it. The physical.
So where is the source of error coming
here?
from?
You see, at this stage, prior to your physical interaction with the object, you open your fingers larger than the object itself, which is called the maximum grip aperture. But at this point, you have no tactile feedback from the object.
Okay, but you see both your fingers and the object?
You see everything, yes.
But in the visual task that you compare that does obey the Weber law, then you don't have anything to compare online, right? You don't have two objects that you compare. You have only one.
You have the object, but your manual estimates are performed like in a different location. So if the object is here, you make your manual estimations here in a classic manual estimation task.
So it's not the issue of relative location that you have both things that you can compare in front of you versus the non-simultaneous representation?
Yeah, it's part of the issue, but it doesn't explain the entire range of results. I agree. But here, I think if you look at the next slides, you'll find a better answer to your question, maybe. So first, if we look at the trajectory of the fingers, we can see that these movements look like this is the aperture between the fingers in flight for grasping and for 2D grasping. And you see the differences. You see that we don't have this margin. We don't have this maximum grip aperture margin when we grasp 2D object because we don't need it. And which again makes it look more similar to perceptual estimates than for real visual motor control or real objects. So when we look at the JNDs during grasping, and this is the point in which you reach the maximum grip aperture. So JNDs, when you grasp 3D objects, do not obey Weber's law, but JNDs, when you approach 2D objects, do obey Weber's law. And we show it also with very realistic photos of objects presented on a computer screen and in different conditions and across the movement trajectory, from the beginning of the movement until your very point in which you touch the screen. Weber's law affects your movement control when it comes to 2D grasping. And I'll show you more data now. We also use the active interactions which are more common to interactions with the objects on touch screens. So we ask participants to dynamically move an object on a screen or rotate it and compared it to a static condition in which you have no requirement to move the object. And here you can see the J and Ds. This is for your question, maybe, Rafi. The J and Ds throughout the movement trajectory for the two tasks. And you can see, first you see that it doesn't matter if you interact with an object or not, you still get Weber's law throughout your entire movement. Even when you touch the object, and this is for Harold's question, you have full feedback of your finger. You can put it theoretically on the exact same point in each trial. You're still affected by relative processing inherent to Weber's law. Okay, so your J and Ds are larger for larger objects during 2D grasping or 2D control. Is it okay? Is it clearer now?
And in the 2D, you do have them simultaneously in front of you, the hand and the object.
Everything is right there, yeah.
It's right there, so it's a relative comparison, okay.
Yes, you have full fit.
Did you try to make 3D virtual images?
Yes. I'll come back to it later. Yeah, maybe yeah. You mean virtual reality? You mean 3D by different pictures to each eye?
With a stereo, yes.
Yeah, we did it as well. I'll present some data soon. So this is not a fully answers your question. We used virtual environment with the Phantom device, which is not a real virtual environment because it's kind of telerobotic control of a virtual environment. And we didn't, here in this environment, we didn't have different inputs for the stereotopic input. But in this environment, Weber's law still affected the trajectories of the fingers. We did give participants some feedback, force feedback here, but it didn't help in terms of making their movements more natural. Okay, but I have other conditions later. I'll come back to it. Just to fill in the gap, we also presented participants with 2D objects in the context of the Garner design, and again asked them to grasp a 2D object in the filtering and baseline blocks. And the findings again showed that you get Garner interference when it comes to 2D grasping, not 3D grasping. And just the last one in this series of experiments, we asked them to grasp virtual objects in the context of wide and narrow range, and again showed that your movements when it comes to 2D objects are affected by the range to the same direction that we saw in perception, but not in 3D grasping in previous experiments. So visual motor interactions with virtual objects are not performed in an analytic, efficient manner. Such action seems to be susceptible to perceptual intrusions. And of course, the question is why. I don't have a good answer to that. I just have proposals. Why are 2D interactions different than 3D interactions? One reason could be the quality of visual feedback, but I don't think it's the reason that we see the differences. We manipulated visual quality. We didn't see any differences. Another important issue could be the quality of the haptic feedback that you receive upon grasping or interacting with a 2D versus 3D object. and I'll go back to it soon. Task demands could also differ between visual motor interactions with virtual objects and real objects. For example, you could be more cautious when you interact in a computerized environment or on a screen compared to your natural automatic movement when it comes to grasping. I'll talk about it shortly and briefly. So this is to answer what Rafi, your question. We also recently used a more sophisticated virtual reality device with 3D vision and high quality images and everything, in which we manipulated the availability of tactile feedback. So we either presented participants with an object, with a physical object at the end, or with no object, no physical object, and they only viewed the virtual object using the glasses. And we tracked their movements. And this is what happens when you don't have tactile feedback at all. And you can see that your movements are always, or in most cases, are adhere to Weber's law in terms of the grasping apertures. When it comes to a condition in which you have full tactile feedback of an object, so we don't see in most stages of the movement, we didn't see any indication of Weber's law. We also looked at the effect of practice here, and we saw some effect of practice in this condition, but I won't go into these details. So does it answer your question, Rafi?
To some extent, I have another question, but in the discussion, I'll ask.
Okay, so I'll finish up with only one study promised, and then I'm off, in which I want to talk about the possibility that one factor that could affect motor control is how much are you conscious, or how much do you program your movements based on conscious processing or monitoring. So it could be more likely that you consciously attend to your movements where you are in a computerized environment. But let's go back to a real environment. What we did here in a recent study with my student Garner, what we did here is to ask participants to grasp objects while consciously monitoring their apertures. And to do that, we asked them simply to stop their movement on flight when they felt that their fingers reached a maximum amount prior to closing on the object. So we asked them to hold their movement, their fingers, during the stage in which they had a maximum grip aperture between their fingers, and looked at the trajectory of this movement compared to a normal grasping movement in which we gave them the same conditions in terms of the time, viewing time, etc. And when we looked at the Ponzo illusion, I know it's not very clear, but you can see at different stages of the movement that these are the trials in which they thought that the larger object is smaller. And you see that their trajectory go in this direction. This is to answer your question, Rafi, what happens initially in the movement. So here you see that initially in the movement, the trajectory go with the illusion. But when it comes to normal grasping, initially in the movement, the trajectory follows this physical size differences between the two objects. So there are differences between consciously monitored grasping, which is intruded by perceptual heuristics, compared to normal grasping. We also showed it in Weber's law in a different experiment, and we showed that when you consciously monitor your movement, your JNDs adhere to Weber's law, but not when you grasp the object in a normal fashion. Okay. So, to conclude, I want to thank my dear collaborators. This is only a partial list. Mel, Dani, Erez, who was my student, former student, Aviad, and Gal were students in my lab as well. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tzvi, for a wonderful and a very inspiring and intriguing talk. I'd like to ask everybody to unmute themselves and give a big applause. And I want to open the stage for questions. I actually have my own questions about feedback from the oculomotor system, whether you think that the fact that people can vary, I mean, my thoughts are that I don't know, that the eyes, in a way, the coordination between the eyes, the focus of the eye may be different between 2D and 3D. And I don't know, but you can answer other questions beforehand.
Yeah, I think there are differences between 3D and 2D objects. I would say look at this study, yes, if I would. And because here we compare the conditions, but you are right, because even in this condition in which you have 3D vision, like it's not a real 3D vision, because you have all kinds of depth fields that you don't have in a virtual environment that happen only for real objects. So it could be the case that some aspects of the visual input may modulate your motor control. I don't have a good answer to it. Good reply.
Yeah, did you consider, so maybe consider tracking the eye movements as well with some, I don't know, just a thought. There may be some information there too.
Yeah, there are groups that are doing that. It's not an easy task, but yes, I know of several groups that try to do it, simultaneous tracking of eyes and hands and fingers during grasp.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Is it known whether, if you compare absolute estimation versus relative, so relative being that you have the two stimuli in front of you, and the absolute that you have to use memory or different settings, does Weber law in perception holds in both, or only in the absolute case?
You always ask the best question. I don't, like, it's a good question. I didn't want to go into this avenue at all, but there is literature on memory-based control, grasping control, and there is a large debate there. Like there are some, including our group, that show that memory-based grasping is subjected to Weber's law and other irregularities, but there are other groups that show that it's not the case. And I myself, I admit that it's not a clear-cut situation. There is lots to do in this domain. Did I answer? I can't go more into that.
As much as you can.
So just if I can, just to clarify and follow up on Ehud's question, let's say you have this illusion in front of you, just like you described before, and the moment the subject starts moving, you turn off the light. So they have to continue. They have to continue based on, you know, immediate iconic memory.
Yes.
So what happened then?
That's an easier question to answer. It's called the open loop condition, in which you don't have a closed loop of your vision. Many people use it. Also in the field of illusions. We ourselves, we had this control in our experiments. So in some of the experiments, we occluded vision immediately when the fingers left the surface, and we didn't see any indication that the movement was different. So it's...
So the same abolishment of the illusion was there too.
However, I have
That's
to
an
say,
important control.
Using position of the fingers to control.
What?
I said that's very convincing. That's great.
Yeah, but I have to say, it also can get you to messy situations. Like in most of my experiments, the closed loop or the open loop condition is not my preferred one, because one drawback of using this kind of condition is that you impair automaticity. It's more difficult for, like, it's not normal to interact with objects when you don't have vision. So you can get used to it, and there are some findings that show that you're not bothered by it, but it's still a factor that could affect your grasping.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
When you have your 2D object on the screen, it differs from the 3D, both visually and also in the fact that you can't anticipate physical contact and lifting it or anything. And I wonder if you have a 3D object, but it's maybe under a transparent panel, so you don't have, although you can act as if you were going to grasp it, you can never complete that grasp. What then happens? Is it like a 2D object or is it like a 3D object?
Yeah, excellent question. So yes, there is a good literature on the effect of feedback. So for example, there are people who use the mirror apparatus in order to create a situation in which what you see is an actual object, but you don't have an object when you grasp. You have nothing. You grasp on thin air. So in these conditions, usually perceptual processing is very profound. For example, when it comes to DF, there are few studies that showed that DF has difficulties in grasping when she doesn't have physical feedback following each of her grasp. And it's true, but the case of 2D grasping is not the same, because you do have some feedback of, I mean, there is something there on the computer screen, and you attach your fingers to this point. It's not that you grasp thin air. You grasp a computer. You touch a computer touch screen at the end of your movement. However, it's not the same quality of haptic feedback as when we interact with real objects. I agree.
But if you had a real block underneath a pane of glass, so that you could act towards it like you can to the 2D thing, you can make contact with the surface like you could with the screen, but you can never actually grasp the ends and lift it. What is that going to be like?
Good, but so you're saying you have a real object, but you don't, the task is not to grasp it, just to touch it or something like that?
Well, it's a real object. It's a real object, but under a screen of glass. And you could have a flat object under a screen of glass. Are those situations different? You reach to it like you would to a touch screen, but you can never actually pick up by the ends.
I can only speculate on that. We try to do it. It's not easy technically, but I don't know. I don't know what would happen there. Okay. Now I have some. For example, I want to mention, we have a study that we didn't publish yet, in which we asked participants to not to grasp real objects, but just to slide them across the surface. So we have physical objects, but instead of grasping, we ask participants to do actions that are similar to what you do with the 2D objects when you interact with them. And what we see is that Weber's law applies to this movement. So the movements are different if you are not asked to physically pick up the object.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Tzvi, so I'd like to thank you again for a wonderful talk. Again, many thanks for joining us for a lovely talk, and join us next week. We have it's going to be on a special time at 3 p.m. Israel time. So 3 hours, anyway, 3 p.m. Israeli time. We have Bob Shapley from New York. So I hope you can join us. And many thanks again.
Thank you.
Nice talk. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.